I'd really like to thank Jeff Angel and Murray Hogarth, Andrew and Sylvia and the team at Green Capital for inviting me to speak today. For a team that's been running the longest and I think the most important business sustainability program in Australia for more than a decade, it's just a real honour to be asked to come and speak to you today as the first speaker in the new program. And as Green Capital transforms into this wonderful new building sustainable economies form, I think you can see that the team has always been thinking about pushing the frontiers and the barriers and the boundaries on how we discuss sustainability in a much more informed and collaborative way. So back in the early 2000s, I think we were all caught up in a debate. It was kind of useful at the time, but I'm very glad we've moved on from it. But it was a debate about the legitimacy of CSR, or what to call it, or whether a corporate could have a social responsibility, whether corporates could act sustainably, whether corporates could be involved in philanthropy. So it was not an easy time, and many of you I've worked with and had conversations with about this over those years. And it was difficult because there was almost no supportive commentary from the financial press or the media generally. In fact, in addition to some healthy scepticism from the environmental movement, who I think quite rightly wanted to question deeply the attitude and the intent of corporates moving into this area, there was also a lot of very angry concern about what listed companies were doing, engaging in the topics of climate change, biodiversity loss, global poverty and the like. So when I was working at IAG, which then was our country's largest general insurer, we looked at the issues of sustainability against that backdrop through the lens of why the corporate should be involved. And it was at that time that Paul Gilding was introduced to me by Mike Hawker, our chief executive at the time. And Paul and Murray Hogarth and the team at ECOS really challenged us as a corporation to understand where we sat in the context of the society. And a number of banks and energy companies came together with the environmental movement. And during that time, we were able to actually advocate for a price on carbon. I think we all felt like we could do anything. We could take on the world, and that the Australian business community was stepping up and finding its place in this global discussion about being a better company and taking care of the long term. And of course, as you all know, that hit a rather difficult set of brick walls. The combination of the GFC and the failures of Copenhagen, and then the terrible political environment that ensued, where we went from dealing with the greatest moral challenge of our time to a debate about whether our scientists could be trusted, set back, I think, the whole cause and made people very nervous about where this issue could sit. I'm very optimistic about where we are today, and believe that we almost had to go through that period to re-emerge, Phoenix-like, to have a proper discussion about these topics through the lens of our economy. So I think we find ourselves at a transformative moment, an absolutely transformative moment, a moment where the task moves to being reframed in the context of building a sustainable economy and understanding what good markets look like. I've come to the view, led by some very good thinkers, that climate change wasn't just a disaster that happened because we all behaved badly. It's actually just the outcome of a bad market system. If the market was pricing the inputs properly, climate change wouldn't be the disaster we have today. That the system and the market imperative and the lack of the right externalities being priced into carbon meant that we thought we were dealing with cheap energy. Fossil fuel energy is not cheap, and the IEA's report actually speaks to that very graphically. So the reframing this around what markets would look like, what are the inputs to markets and defining economies, I think goes to the core of the change that's underway that does mean that we are at that Phoenix moment. I think we've moved on from the discussion of fiduciary duties, not encouraging us to think about these things, to the markets beginning to say, what are you doing? Where is your long-term plan? What are your risk strategies? Where do you put climate change in your risk plan? So whilst I am really generally optimistic, and I'm an optimist by heart, I think it's always really important to be honest. And so what I want to say to you today is I do think that optimism has to be tempered slightly with the realism about the responsibilities of leadership required right now. Because I think our leadership has failed us and failed a generation that's arriving and saying we expect more of you and we will do more, and sometimes if we can, we'll do it without you. We'll do it without the corporate model, we'll do it in different ways. And the possibilities that we need to grab require great leadership. We've passed the time where those with influence and capacity can sit back and wait for others to transform our economies or rely on governments to do the heavy lifting. As we see daily around the world, governments are really struggling with transformation, and the short cycle of political analysis and activity limits their capacity for serious and lasting change, at least at the moment. And yet around us, the global community of citizens is moving. It's transforming and finding innovative ways to respond to many of our so-called wicked problems. We only need to look at the remarkable growth of the collaborative consumer or the sharing economy. Rachel Botsman's work in this area is staggering, and it's moving rapidly all around the world. Innovations in business models are swirling around us, guided by new expectations and concerns of communities and consumers, facilitated by technology, collaboration, and an attention to values. And the communities are mobilising in interesting and dynamic ways. I want to acknowledge that Natalie Isaacs is in the audience today, the founder of the 1 Million Women campaign. 1 Million Women is an extraordinary example of a community-based organisation of women determined to cut carbon. But it's non-ideological, it's non-political, it's simply a collaborative effort of women all around the country and one day all around the world who share with each other an ambition to do better. And increasingly, you'll see 1 Million Women emerging as playing a real role in how the 70% of consumer decisions that are made by women become an instructive part of how we rethink the role of the market and women's role in markets. It'll be an extraordinary journey, and we shouldn't take our eyes off 1 Million Women and the movement of women that lies ahead that will help move our economies. If I also give the example of every morning when I wake up and check my Twitter feed. I love Twitter most of the time. But what I find is every time I flick through the Twitter feed overnight and I look at what's happening all around the world and the incredible optimism, the incredible level of passion around building stronger, resilient communities, engaged in collaborative consumerism, new values emerging, and all being facilitated by technology that's instantaneous and doesn't judge people from where they are, but what their values are and what they care about. And that gives me great hope that we are moving very rapidly to building sustainable economies in new ways that maybe we don't even grasp yet. So what I'd like to do today is just look at a couple of moments which for me have started to reset the task ahead more from the global and corporate context. The first occurred in January this year when the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund gave her address to the World Economic Forum. Christine Lagarde entitled her remarks, "A New Global Economy for a New Generation." As she considered the longer horizon for the global economy, she took into account 4 global pivot points. The demand for individual empowerment, particularly from women. A reallocation of political and economic power across the world, but particularly in Asia. Seismic shifts in demographics, and increased vulnerability from climate change, resource scarcity, and the potential for major social and economic upheaval, which we're seeing right around the world at the moment. Every night there's a new occurrence of a public demonstration in the European cities, and it's spreading around the world. In the Australian context, I would add a couple of more matters to her pivot points, but I'd leave you to look at the megatrends identified by the CSIRO to see which of those ones are transforming the environmental, economic and social conditions here in Australia. Lagarde said that navigating these huge challenges requires engagement with the new generation on the march and a clear need to embrace the emerging values of this new generation. The 3 emerging values she identified were greater openness, stronger inclusion and better accountability. In a discussion of each value, there are strong recommendations for addressing rising economic inequality, redefining the quality of growth and prosperity, and making gender inclusion a key economic priority. She reminds us of the need for solidarity and collaboration across the generations, imploring us to speak to everyone, young and old, no matter what background, and she identifies climate change, without a doubt, as the greatest economic challenge of the 21st century. It's interesting stuff for the head of the IMF addressing the World Economic Forum to be quite as bold as she was. She goes on to say, good ecology is good economics. This is one reason why getting carbon pricing right and removing fossil fuel subsidies are too important, she says, and this too is an element of inclusion. She says, the goal of the private sector cannot be only profit. It must also be to add value, create jobs, develop the new ideas that drive an economy forward. She concludes by proposing a new global economy marked by rapidly shifting circumstances and new modes of thinking, a bit like the Green Capital team. My second example of strong change comes from within the Australian corporate sector. We're seeing strong adoption of the early stages of sustainable action, like energy efficiency, and across several sectors, companies are now working collaboratively with new models of sustainable cities and regions. The very good companies know this means deep cultural transformation in their organisations and are moving to skill managers and leaders with the new tools of sustainable development. I've also been following the work created by the collaboration of GlobeScan and Sustainability, which recently resulted in the release of their report, the Regeneration Roadmap. They speak of the crucial need for business leaders to influence and accelerate wider systemic changes and to move the economy and shift the definition of the economy itself. Their summary of the attributes that they would expect to see exhibited by good companies and good leaders is worth reviewing, as it extends well beyond the traditional expectations that we see and does include seeking strong policy advocacy in the interests of the broader new economy. The third change I'd like to reflect upon is the impact of large-scale disasters on moving an understanding of climate change and sustainability and the need for new models. And it's an example that would spring immediately to mind for all of you, and it's what happened in New York City with Superstorm Sandy, because what's happened as a result is the most staggering response by a leadership, a man who acts as a leader in the Mayor Bloomberg, who immediately moved to say, this can never happen again, and we need to learn about the vulnerability of coastal city settlements. On June 11, just a week ago, the Mayor released his document, A Stronger, More Resilient New York, which is a comprehensive plan that makes much needed recommendations for rebuilding communities impacted by Sandy and increasing resilience of infrastructure and buildings throughout that city. I'd also encourage you to have a look at the work done in Australia at the moment. It's not getting nearly enough airplay. Maria and I have the great privilege of sitting on the Advisory Council, and that's the CSIRO Climate Adaptation Flagship. The work the flagship is doing to actually recommend what good adaptation looks like in this country and what good investments would mean to actually justify our relationship with the future, where we know there'll be much more very damaging climate events hitting our homes and our communities. The work is just terrific. And I think we've got to start thinking about adaptation as part of this new economy. We can't just think about mitigation. The adaptation story is just as important. There is a National Sustainability Council. It was formed at the end of 2012, and it produced the first Sustainable Australia report just a couple of months ago, called Sustainable Australia 2013. It was an initiative of the Minister for Sustainability, Tony Burke, and the council is a great reflection of people from all across the economy looking at sustainability, not just from the environmental perspective, but from the economic and social. It aims to report every 2 years and look at important developments that affect Australia's sustainability in social, environmental and economic capital. It is meant to start a conversation with Australia, and the report itself is something I'm very proud of, as is the full council. And it really does look at the things we all need to take into account if we're going to have a sustainable economy in this country. And the information in it provides the starting point for that conversation. And I guess with such an extraordinary document being released, I do find it interesting that, in reflecting on leadership, at the little amount of energy that's gone in by the media and by senior business leaders in engaging with the report. It's actually like giving people a blueprint to say what lies ahead and what you might like to be thinking about. We are the people we've been waiting for. And diversity is key to this, because if we're the people we've been working for, we've got to use the full strength of our community in all its full diversity, men and women, young and old, from whatever cultural background and from whatever sector you have. You are part of this conversation of change. And you wouldn't believe the level of optimism and expectation of great things that the regions believe in and that local government believes in. They've been talking about all things sustainability and all things to do with new markets and new economies. They're getting on with it at a very localised region and regional level, and they're learning to collaborate. As one mayor said to me, not just with each other and not just with other levels of government, but with business, with activism, with local community members. They're doing extraordinary things, and we just don't hear about it. So there is change occurring. It's happening at levels that we need to really invest in and understand and learn from the new skills that are emerging about collaboration and stakeholder engagement coming from local government, people close to people who want to change. The second one is a kind of, I wondered about whether I'd use this as my closing example. There's been 20, if not 30 years of reports to the Australian Army and the Australian Defence Force on the treatment of women and the treatment of anyone different in the armed forces, and the ways in which it needed to change as a matter of priority. It took an extreme event to collide with a great leader. And General David Morrison, as the Chief of Army, I now regard as a great Australian leader, not just as an army leader, but he has set a tone for how change is possible. But if you watch General David Morrison, he makes a number of incredible points. One is that everyone is responsible for the environment in which we operate. He's using that in the context of the Australian Army, but I use that more generally. We're all responsible for our environment. We all have a capacity to change. He talks about the need for moral courage. He just says very simply, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. He's made it quite clear. He hasn't shirked the responsibility of leadership. And if I think about the sustainability community and leadership in this community, more broadly, we need lots more of us standing up on our boards, in chief executive rooms, in management committees, at Green Capital, in all our organisations, and just saying the standard of the current way in which we think about our economy is not good enough. It's not valuing the things that we know matter to our communities and to each of us. It lacks the integrity of what arts and creativity tell us. It doesn't put a price on beauty and on love and on respect. It looks at the pure financials. And I think what Green Capital is doing in driving us to think about an emerging set of economies based on where we as populations want to be is guiding us to a whole new level of sustainability. But it will take leadership at all levels, and I hope out of today we all leave as better leaders. Thank you.